Thank you. Thanks, Andy. Appreciate it. Very
Honey,
happy
I can't get this
to.
to go
Oh,
less
and
loud. Is it for you?
can we can people please mute their microphones other than Peter while we are in this phase of the presentation? Thank you.
I will try to leave us plenty of time for discussion there. So, although I'm sure, as always, I have far more material to talk about than I could cover, but we'll see how it goes. Um, so, um, so thought it would be philosophy and politics would be a good essay to discuss. It's an essay I haven't looked at in a while. It was based upon a talk Russell gave in 1946, published as, I call it a booklet here. I mean, I think we were just before that we started having discussion about like booklet, pamphlet, what to call it. I called it a booklet there. I think it's hard to call it a book given that the entire thing was then reprinted inside of another book in Unpopular Essays a few years later. And then, of course, it appears in the collected papers, and all of my references are going to be that version of it. I did want to say a few words about why I think this is an important paper and why it's worth spending some time on. Um, Russell does not talk a lot about how philosophy and politics should intersect, either generally or in terms of his philosophy and politics. Russell was the great public thinker. Russell was also a great philosopher. But finding places where the twain explicitly meets is a tricky one. I mean, it's actually an interesting question. Like when Russell writes things something like Power and New Social Analysis or Principles of Social Construction, did he see himself as doing philosophy? Did he see himself as doing political philosophy? Did he even like the idea of political philosophy? I think is a very open question. And this is an essay which helps us to confront that idea question. I think it's also very important given the timing of when it was written. This appears again in 1947. Russell's History of Western Philosophy was just written 2 years before. And as has been noted a number of times recently, this is a book which was heavily informed by an aborted book Russell worked on in the 30s on the intellectual origins of fascism. The history of Western philosophy is all about the relationship between the social forces and the things happening on the ground in social life and the philosophy that happens at the time and the reciprocal influence the two of them have on them. And so naturally, it's important. A large part of what the book is about is like, well, how did we wind up where we are now in the world in the 1940s, fighting against totalitarianism? What are the intellectual forces that got us here and things like that? And that's why I gave an earlier talk on the way Russell treats Rousseau in History of Western Philosophy. That was an earlier Russelliana of mine. And I think an important conclusion I came away from that essay thinking was the chapter on Rousseau, that Russell thought Rousseau did philosophy the wrong way. And because he was doing it wrong, it led him astray politically. But that raises the question, well, okay, if Rousseau was doing it wrong, what's the right way to do philosophy there? And if we do it the right way, will it lead us into good conclusion? Will it lead us to the correct political conclusions? That I think is a very interesting question, and I think Russell's position on it seems to me to be a little tricky to figure out. And so I'd welcome talking to people about it. I'm going to try to talk about what I see in philosophy and politics on this question, and some of the things that kind of I find puzzling, and then maybe we can talk about that. So, what happens in the essay Philosophy and Politics? Well, I think that in particular there are two things that are going on there. On the one hand, there is some general thoughts about the way philosophy and politics should relate together, and also the bad ways, the ways it shouldn't relate together. And there's also a series of specific examples about the relationship. And a lot of the specific examples are the most entertaining things in it, of course, because that's the part where he pummels Plato quite vigorously, as he does in History of Western Philosophy. It's the part where he pummels Hegel, I think, even more enthusiastically than he does in History of Western Philosophy. These are some of the more entertaining notes, and also some of the points where he makes some very strong points. But in reading it, I ask myself, Do the specific stories he offers about Hegel, about Plato, about Bach, about others, do they fit together with the general account that he offers about the relationship between philosophy and politics? Are they consistent with each other? And the reason I wonder about that is because Russell seems, in this essay, at least tempted by the idea that philosophy simply shouldn't have anything to do with human concerns, including politics. That when you're doing it right, it's not about human concerns. But at the same time, he also makes a strong argument that one specific type of philosophy, empiricism, is desirable in part because of the political implications it has. And so my question, I guess, is this all consistent? Can Russell get away with what he's doing here? And I'm trying to figure that out. So I'll give you my thoughts on the subject. So most of the rest of my slides are not particularly pretty. There are a lot of quotes that I want to talk around and think about here. So this is how Russell starts the essay by noting that the British are distinguished among the nations of modern Europe on the one hand by the excellence of their philosophers, and on the other hand by their contempt for philosophy. In both respects, they showed their wisdom. By the way, Andy mentioned that I'm missing a swing dance workshop tonight because of this talk. My swing dance teacher is a bit of a nerd, so I told her I was missing it because I was giving this talk, and I sent her this reading. And she said she read the first sentence and she wrote me back to say, "I'm hooked." Unfortunately, she also apparently thought she didn't read my email too carefully, and she thought I actually wrote this. So I had to sort of shamefacedly admit, nah, I can't quite write like this, unfortunately. But hopefully she'll still read the whole thing, and we could talk about it later. But again, Russell notes here, to get back to the text, philosophy, if it is bad philosophy, may be dangerous and therefore deserves the degree of negative respect which we accord to lightning and tigers. What positive respect may be due to good philosophy, I leave to the moment an open question. So he's obviously more concerned about doing philosophy wrong than he is about doing it right in terms of their political implications. He wants to consider the relationship of philosophies to political systems as it has in fact existed, and inquire how far it's a valid logical relationship, and how far, even if not logical, it has a psychological inevitability. Because it certainly thinks it's had a meaningful impact. Now, this is where he expresses an idea that I think is a very interesting idea about the relationship between philosophy and politics. He says, philosophy, as pursued in the universities of the Western democratic world, is at least in intention part of a pursuit of knowledge aiming at the same kind of detachment as is sought in science, and not required by the authorities to arrive at conclusions convenient to government. Many teachers of philosophy would repudiate not only the intention to influence their pupils' politics, but also the view that philosophy should inculcate virtue. This, they would say, has as little to do with philosophy as with the physicist or the chemist. Knowledge, they would say, should be the sole purpose of university teaching. Virtue should be left to parents, schoolmasters, and churches. And I think this is a very interesting passage in terms of the way he thinks about what philosophy ought to do, because he seems to be running together two ideas which I think in principle could very easily be kept apart. On the one hand, there's the idea, well, philosophy should be done impartially, it should be done objectively, it should not be done, one should not simply give the conclusions that you are being paid to give. That would be true if you were teaching science too. I mean, as Russell points out later, in the Soviet Union, they pay you to teach. The government orders you to teach certain kinds of biology too. But that seems to be separable from the question of whether or not, when you're dealing with philosophy, you should try to inculcate virtue. You should try to say, look, certain kinds of conclusions about justice or about freedom or about rights are true, and I mean, that's the product of my philosophical investigation. That seems like something legitimately one could do, but Russell seems to think that's already specious or problem, according to the modern way of doing things in universities. Someone's got their mic on.
Hey, Giovanni, can you mute? Thanks.
Thank you. And just to be clear, Russell says this view of philosophy is one with which I have much sympathy. It's a modern view, and so he's kind of attracted to it. He's kind of endorsing that way of thinking about philosophy. The old-fashioned way of doing philosophy has resulted from the attempt to produce a synthesis of science and religion, to combine a doctrine as to the nature of the universe and man's place in it with a practical ethic inculcating what was considered the best way of life. And philosophy is distinguished by religion. It's not an appeal to authority or tradition. And it's not distinguished from science by the fact that an essential part of its purpose is to tell men how to live. And again, this is the version of the way of doing philosophy that Russell is reacting against, that he doesn't, this is the older way of doing it, not the modern way. And he thinks that this is doing something wrong. One could at least kind of push on that, because it would certainly seem reasonable to say, well, look, surely if I study the nature of the universe and man's place in it, it's going to have ethical and conclusions. It's going to have conclusions for the way we ought to live. It's going to have conclusions for politics. Why shouldn't that be part of philosophy as well? Now, Russell could perhaps say here, well, sure, it has those conclusions, but that's not the philosopher's problem anymore to worry about those kind of things there. That would be a consistent position. I'm not sure whether it would be one would want to endorse. Especially given what he says, and this is a theme that is running through a lot of Russell's writing at the time. He says, the fundamental problem of ethics and politics is that of finding some way of reconciling the needs of social life with the urgency of individual desires. And, he wrote a book of just a few years earlier on freedom versus organization. Right around this time, I think it's a little after this comes authority in the individual. So he's thinking a lot about this. But then he writes, philosophers, when they have tackled the problem of preserving social coherence, have sought solutions less obviously dependent upon dogma than those offered by official religions. He says, most philosophies are your reaction against skepticism. It has arisen in ages when authority no longer sufficed to produce the socially necessary minimum of belief, so that nominally irrational, note that ominous word, nominally irrational arguments had to be invented to secure the same result. This motive has led to a deep insincerity infecting most philosophy, both ancient and modern. There has been a fear, often unconscious, that clear thinking would lead to anarchy, and this fear has led philosophers to hide in mists of fallacy and obscurity. And so, again, I think there's something here that's going on that's a little tricky. On the one hand, it's perfectly legitimate for Russell to say, look, a lot of the efforts of philosophers to tackle this problem have been done in bad faith. They've been done with a view to fealty to power, things like that. They've been done badly. But here, Russell seems to think that the very fact that philosophers have been tackling this problem is already kind of suspect. And that seems like a very strange thing to do. This seems like a strange thing for the man who wrote Authority and Individual to be doing, to say that there's something suspect in the very enterprise. Again, maybe Russell could say, well, fine, when I'm doing that, I'm not doing philosophy, though. That's not what philosophy is about. If he wants to draw the line there that way, though, that would seem to be a very puzzling way, in my opinion, there. He goes on to talk about his nemeses, Plato and Hegel, and their approach, and the ones that they are reacting against, Democritus and Locke. The latter are associated with empiricism, which is associated with democracy and a more or less utilitarian ethic. And again, here there's one can ask questions, like he's saying, okay, so Plato and Hegel were doing the bad job of connecting freedom and organization. That's the wrong way to do it. They reach conclusions that are terrible that we can't endorse. Okay, that's one thing you could say, perfectly reasonably. But then does that mean that Democritus and Locke were doing this? We're attempting the same enterprise, but we're doing it right. Again, he seems to suggest that there's something already a little suspect about the enterprise itself, and that seems a little inconsistent with endorsing Democritus and Locke and saying, "Oh, the way they did it is just fine." And then we start to get into the specifics. Of course, we have the wonderful send-up of Plato. I won't spend a lot of time on the details, although we can if people like, I just love the line that Plato's Republic should have been admired on its political side by decent people is perhaps the most astonishing example of literary snobbery in all of history. I think this is something this is a theme I often come back to when I teach the Republic, actually. He further says that, okay, one of the things Plato got wildly wrong, and we know especially from science now, is this idea of static perfection, just completely inapplicable to our understanding of the world, inapplicable to our understanding of human affairs. But then he goes on to say, but change is one thing and progress is another. And he goes on to suggest that even to talk about the idea that there is such a thing as progress is getting into philosophers onto thin ice. And this is which is going to take him into his pummeling of Hegel. And I want to raise a few problems. There are some wonderful bits about the way he treats Hegel. I just love the line in there about, if you were thinking about Cape Horn, the right way of thinking about it is to think of the absolute mind thinking Cape Horny thoughts or something like that. That's a great line. But I want to talk about this idea about, well, is there something philosophically suspect about talking about progress? He certainly says, he says, well, we don't get much view of progress from science there. Our own planet, which philosophers are apt to take a parochial and excessive interest, was once too hot to support life and will in time be too cold. After ages during which the Earth produced harmless trilobites and butterflies, evolution progressed to the point at which it generated Neros, Genghis Khans, and Hitlers. This, however, is a passing nightmare. In time, the Earth will become again incapable of supporting life, and peace will return. So, I mean, that seems to be, again, he seems to be, with Russell, it's often you have to wonder like how much of his tongue is in cheek when he writes. That's often a question I ask myself when I'm reading Russell. But he seems to be saying, well, to take an interest in the affairs of this planet is somehow already to be a bad philosopher. If you take an alternative perspective, life on this planet is of no significance whatsoever. To suggest that philosophy is sort of committing one to that position, that's a pretty strong claim. I think it's one could certainly want to raise questions about. And he goes on now to say, well, some philosophers don't like this. They say there's a progress that they have seen in the world. And he, again, pummels them for thinking that they are doing that for what he thinks to be doing bad philosophy as their way of doing it. And I won't read the whole passage here. It's a long passage where he talks about philosophers doing this badly. But here's the one where he comes to a very interesting point. He talks about how philosophers have tried to read progress into history and how dangerous that is. And how does he address this? Well, by pummeling Hegel. He says the man who first fully developed this point of view is Hegel. Hegel's philosophy is so odd that one would not have expected him to be able to get sane man to accept it, but he did. He set it out with so much obscurity that people thought it must be profound. It can be quite easily expounded loosely in words of one syllable, but then its absurdity becomes obvious. So here, this is important because what Russell goes on in this section to do is to try to make 2 points. One is that Hegel has a philosophy of progress. He's the first modern attempt at this philosophy of progress. And 2, to say that it led him into highly undesirable political conclusions. I mean, he was, of course, as a big fan of the Prussian state. I thought this is very interesting that he does this because, well, and I've raised this question a couple of times about Russell. What about that Kant guy? If you know your history of philosophy, you know that before Hegel started talking about progress in history, there was the guy who wrote Idea of History from a Cosmopolitan Intent, the guy who wrote Perpetual Peace, who most definitely was from a very liberal perspective looking at history and finding progress in it. What about him? Why isn't he the first philosopher to try to read history as having a progress? Kant only gets mentioned twice in Philosophy and Politics. The first time is to say that Nazis upheld German idealism, though the degree of allegiance to be given to Kant, Fichte, or Hegel, respectively, was not clearly laid down. And here I just have to point out, Russell's all over the bloody map when he talks about Kant. He calls him a liberal in this essay. Elsewhere, as I think in one of the earlier essays I did, he says it was the official Kant's philosophy was the official philosophy of the Nazi state. Somewhere else he says that the Nazis hated Kant, and it's just like, I don't even know what to say, except it's like he doesn't seem to be particularly concerned about being consistent on the subject of Kant there. He then writes, the other passage where he mentions Kant, Protagoras was answered by Plato, answered in quotes, Hume by Kant and Hegel. In each case, the philosophical world heaved a sigh of relief and refrained from examining too nicely the intellectual validity of the answer. which in each case had political as well as theoretical consequences, though in the case of the answer to Hume, it was not the liberal Kant, but the reactionary Hegel who developed the political consequences. That just seems wrong to me there. I'm not quite sure in what sense he could justify that statement that it was that Kant and not Hegel and not Kant develops the political consequences of this approach, philosophical approach to history. What is Kant doing wrong there? Kant's doing it. Why is it that Hegel's is the natural way to do it and Kant's is not? Because Kant is reaching very different conclusions from Hegel. Is Hegel doing if Hegel is doing is the more natural way of thinking about it? Why? What is the reason for it? He never tells us. He then goes on to endorse what he thinks is the only philosophy that could afford a theoretical justification of democracy, and that's empiricism. He associates this, of course, with Locke as the founder of empiricism, and clear how closely it's connected with his view of liberty and toleration. He's never tired of emphasizing the uncertainty of most of our knowledge, with the intention of making men aware that they may be mistaken, and that they should take account of this possibility in all their dealings with men of opinions different from their own. It's a very good, it's very important and reasonable to say that like there are these features of Locke's philosophy which naturally connect to liberal democracy, especially given that Locke was one of the early big proponent of liberal democracy. But it is one at least has to qualify that claim that this is a natural product of empiricism, because of course Locke is also the great apostle of natural rights. Natural rights are not the kind of thing you're going to get straight out of an empiricism, and yet it was a deeply important part of Locke's political philosophy. One of the things I find a little frustrating about Russell is the way that he runs together figures like Locke, like I said, the apostle of natural rights, with figures like Bentham, the guy who said natural rights were nonsense upon stilts, and acts like, oh, well, that's not really that important. Is it though? Aren't those that kind of an important difference? Maybe that worth thinking about. I think maybe it is there. Like I said, I think that he's perfectly justified in associating with Locke this idea about trying to diminish enthusiasm and diminish fanaticism and the good political consequences of that. That's a very reasonable conclusion. But the idea that this is purely a story about empiricism, it is at least something one can query. And here again, he emphasizes that what makes this outlook, makes theoretical philosophy in it done well fit with the liberal outlook is the fact that the liberal outlook is all about not what opinions are held, but how they are held. That does raise a question, though, about whether or not the liberal outlook must be attached to any philosophical school. I mean, is empiricism the only philosophical school that one could lead you to have opinions held non-dogmatically? One could at least ask the question: could you be an idealist and not be dogmatic about your conclusions? It's a question: is one, if one does not take the empiricist approach, is one already just doing philosophy wrong right from the start? And here is more of Locke getting into the subject. I won't get into it in the interest of time because I want to leave us time to talk. And this is a passage that already got some discussion on the BRS list, and so I figured I should put it up just in case we want to talk about it here. The idea that this attitude of not embracing too much certainty can have important consequences, like it is not worthwhile to inflict a comparatively certain present evil for the sake of a completely doubtful future good. And I take this to be, as he runs through the evils of Nazism and of Marxism and of Christianity, I would say I follow people on the list who are talking about this, saying he seems to be saying that these are all instances where the evils they inflict now are extremely certain. The alleged amazing benefits in the future are incredibly and that it therefore can make no sense, if you are concerned about summing up good, to inflict massive evils, which you cannot rationally have any strong grounds for thinking are going to happen. But we can talk more about that if people want. He does also, near the end, have a very interesting discussion about the advantages, political advantages, of non-dogmatic systems. He thinks, in fact, that contrary to what some people are saying, the last thing in the world liberal democracy needs is a fanatical creed behind it. The fanatical creeds can, in fact, be very counterproductive. As he says, they have the disadvantages of involving false beliefs on practically important matters of fact, and they arouse violent hostility in those who do not share the fanaticism in question. I think this is a very insightful observation. I wouldn't say anything negative about it, but we can talk about it if you like. And here he near the conclusion, he says, empiricism is to be commended not only on the grounds of its greater truth, but also on ethical grounds. Dogma demands authority rather than intelligent thought as the source of opinion. It requires persecution of heretics and hostility to unbelievers. It asks of its disciples that they should inhibit natural kindliness in favor of systematic hatred. Argument is not that way. We get into war, and what I think is interesting about that is that early on in the essay, he seems to castigate philosophers for adopting their position or endorsing their position because of they're worried about the problem of social order or other kinds of ethical concerns. He said we shouldn't do that. We should not endorse philosophy. It's supposed to be objective. It's supposed to, it's not supposed to get into those matters. We absolutely should not be letting our ethical considerations influence what philosophy adopts. And here he's telling us, but you know why? One of the reasons empiricism is great, it's got these great ethical consequences. I don't know. Is that consistent with what he said before? Again, you could argue that he's correct to say, look, empiricism is just better all around than these other positions. But then he's not saying these other ways of doing philosophy are inherently wrong. He's just saying they've reached wrong conclusions. They're saying, okay, they were doing the correct kind of thing. They just did it badly. And this is, if we do it the correct way, we'll come to these conclusions. As opposed to what he seems to be saying, which is where he's kind of suggesting that even to bring in the ethical grounds is already to be starting off on the wrong foot when you're doing philosophy. And this is the last paragraph. I'll leave it with here. He says, I conclude that in our day, as in the time of Locke, empiricist liberalism is the only philosophy that can be accepted by a man who, on the one hand, demands scientific evidence for the beliefs, and the other hand, desires human happiness more than the prevalence of this or that party or creed. Our confused and difficult world needs various things to escape disaster, and among these, one of the most necessary is that in the nations which still uphold liberal beliefs, these beliefs should be wholehearted and profound, not apologetic towards dogma of right and left. Again, there is this mixing of the fact that empiricism is, he thinks, the true or the best philosophy out there, but at the same time is urging it on its ethical grounds as well. So just some concluding thoughts, and then we'll open up for some conversation. So Russell begins by expressing suspicion of the very idea of connecting philosophy with ethics and politics. He's worried about the fact that he thinks philosophy is better treated on the model of the sciences there. And of course, the sciences, when you're doing physics and you're doing chemistry, you don't worry about these kind of things. But he also admits that philosophy, I think, does have, just like science, can have a philosophical analysis can have profound impacts on the way we view the world. And he further goes on to defend one philosophy in part based on its implications to the ethics and politics. And I think that defense is actually quite compelling. He does a very good job of suggesting why Lockean style liberal democracy is better all around. But his own approach to philosophy seems to render just saying what I just said, seem a little bit suspect. And I find it a little strange that he tries to do things that way. It seems certainly hard for Russell to sustain the modern attitude that says philosophy should be irrelevant to politics. One of his reasons for thinking this, of course, I think it's no way to get around mentioning the fact that Russell's non-cognitivism in ethics certainly leaves him very suspicious of any attempts to ground claims like this outcome is more just or this is more in accord with natural rights or whatever as already philosophically problematic. But importantly, it's not what Russell is doing in practice in this. He is definitely drawing implications from ethics and politics from philosophy, and he does it pretty well, actually. So I'm very like many people, I think, very fond of the particular conclusions that he argues in favor of in terms of the relationship of philosophy and politics. But his whole story about what that relationship should be is one I find a little bit problematic, and I think maybe it'd be worth discussing. So with that, I'm going to wrap up, and hopefully that will leave us with plenty of time to talk. Thanks.